So good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining this early morning in early spring. My name's Nella Bloom. I'm the managing member of Bloom and Bloom. We're a law firm based in Philadelphia, but I'm also licensed to practice in New Jersey and Delaware. And I've been a Beacon member since November, and it's been amazing. I've never joined an organization before where there were so many different ways of meeting people. I think it's fantastic. And we'll be talking about law topics for small businesses. And these may be topics that affect you, but more likely, because this is the small business subgroup, you're going to run into situations where your clients say things and they'll trigger in your mind these topics. And so you'll be able to issue spot for your clients what maybe they need to rethink, or maybe they need to be pulled back from. But as a first note, disclaimer, I'm not your lawyer. And you will know if I am your lawyer because you will sign an engagement letter with me. And that is when our relationship starts. But right now we are having a conversation. And if you have specific questions, I'll do my best to address it. Well, if you have general questions, I can answer those. But if you have specific questions about a situation that affects you or a client of yours, I would probably want you to consult your own attorney or advisor on that. In terms of questions, actually, we didn't discuss this. I'm not entirely sure. I suppose if you have a question, I'm not sure I would see you raise your hand because I'm looking at the presentation and not at the squares.
Let's have them put it in the chat or just say, hey, I have a question. And when we get to a pause.
Perfect. Love it. Okay. So here's what we're going to talk about. How do you start the business? How do you protect it once it exists? What are some contractual provisions you might see that you might need to read a couple times or read out loud, which is what I sometimes do to make sure I understand them? And how do you know if the business is in trouble, if it needs help? So part one is, how do you form this thing? And we approach this like we are investigative reporters. Who, what, when, where. We don't do why, we do how. Why, hopefully you know why. If you don't know why, then maybe you shouldn't be starting a business in the first place. But we'll be talking about who's involved. What corporate form might you think about using? When do you form a business? Where might you form a business? And what are the mechanics? How do you do it? So first, who is going to be involved? Now, this is either a simple question, which is to say you got one person, easy enough. You don't need to worry about relative ownership percentages. But when you have more than one actor, whether that person is donating time or money or something else of value, then you get into a little bit more of an ownership percentage conversation. Usually, what we do is we look at how much relative value is one person putting in as opposed to the other. So if one person is donating all of the time, all of the money, and the other person's just sort of standing there, well, maybe that person who's just sort of standing there looking pretty doesn't get as much of the equity as the other person. Now, I know a lot of businesses love 50-50. I hate 50-50, and I have a lot of thoughts on 50-50 ownership. A day, or God forbid, someone does something detrimental to the business. There's not really much that can be done. You're kind of stuck there with a partner who won't be ousted or won't be reined in. I've had a handful of clients over the years who have not listened to me and gone 50-50. And let's say there are 6 of those. I would say 4 or 5 of them have come back to me later and said, we've had a problem and we can't get past it. I'm not exaggerating. Unfortunately, it happens a lot. So investment of time and money is one aspect. And then there's another aspect that when you start up, if you want to go ultimately seek minority-owned business certification or women-owned business certification or another specialized certification, then whoever is the person upon whom this certification qualification rests has to have at least 51%. And that means ownership. It means operational and managerial control as well. So if I am going into business with 3 of my best friends and they're all men, I still have to have 51%. I cannot be outvoted. Some people have a problem with this, but if you don't do that, you don't qualify. Another thing to think about in terms of who's starting up this business is whether there are any pre-existing agreements that might curtail someone's involvement. So let's say that I have sold my expert bespoke cross-stitch business. I took up a new hobby recently, as you can probably tell. So I have a cross-stitch business. It's brilliant. And I just sold it to someone. And I have agreed in that sale that for 5 years, I will not start another cross-stitch business, sell cross-stitch products, advise, consult, be an employee of any business that does cross-stitch. Maybe I'm not the best person to start up a new cross-stitch business. Maybe you want to leave me out for 5 years if you're starting up a similar business. The other issue, one of many issues, but another issue that you might want to think about is, are any of the equity holders going to be non-human? Are they going to be corporations? Are you looking at angel investment? Are you positioning this for VC investment at some point down the line? Because if you are, then the S corporation form is going to be off limits for you right away. We'll talk about that in a minute, but these are some of the ideas about who is going to be involved. So then what are some options for organizing? Well, let's talk about corporations first, because we started there. The C corporation is your typical multinational. We're going public someday. We want to sell our shares on an open market. Or we're going to have products that we send out internationally. Maybe that's what you want to do. Maybe that's a corporate form that would work. An S corporation is a much more limited corporate form. It has to have a limited number of shareholders. It is a pass-through entity for tax purposes. It is, and all the shareholders have to be humans. They can't be companies, and they have to be adults and citizens of the US. So if you have holders or interest holders, potential interest holders who don't qualify, then it may be that the S corporation form would be invalidated. You don't want that. If you select a certain corporate form, you want to keep it, right? So I'm sure we're familiar with limited liability companies. But the thing to remember about these is that they are creatures of contract. So but if you don't have written down what your agreement is among yourselves, then it is probably not the best way of proceeding. You really want to have something strong in place so that everybody who is a member of this organization knows things like how they will be bought out, whether they can, what happens if they, God forbid, they die or become incapacitated, what's going to happen to the proceeds of the company if it dissolves, things like that. And nonprofits, we're mostly familiar with nonprofits. The thing I think to remember about nonprofits specifically is that you can start a nonprofit under state law, and it will not necessarily be tax exempt. Tax exemption is determined by the IRS. So I'm doing this right now with a client. They want to start a new nonprofit. So I've formed for them a nonprofit in Pennsylvania, which is fine, but it doesn't mean they're tax exempt. We still need to prepare all of the corporate documentation, like the nonprofit bylaws and conflicts of interest policies and things like that. Then we take all of that material plus additional material, we put it into a big old application to the IRS, and we send it to the IRS and say, please, won't you let us be tax exempt? Only once the IRS allows us to are we tax exempt. So there's nonprofit formation under state law, and then there's being tax exempt, two different things. And this is a hot topic, is a public benefit company. Let's talk a little bit about this, because these rules are pretty new. And they've been adopted state by state. So every state has a different rule about what public benefit companies are and what they need to do. But the basics are that this is a for-profit company or corporation that's created under state law, and it has a purpose of creating a general public benefit. Well, what does that mean? Well, it doesn't mean that you don't make money. What it means is that the directors and officers have to make decisions based not just on the interests of shareholders, which is what a corporation or company usually does, but also they have to consider the decision's impact on employees, on customers, suppliers, the community, the environment. And every year they have to report what they've done. So they have to either, depending on state law, they either have to file of record with the Department of State or, issue an annual report, maybe put it up on their website to say, here is our public benefit purpose. Here's what we did over the year to meet that public benefit purpose or attempt to meet that public benefit purpose. And here's how we did. Now, this is not to be confused with B Corp certification. Some businesses that have a public interest bent want to have it's essentially like a little advertising sticker that you would put at the bottom of your website or your email, and it says B Lab certified or B Corp certified. B Corp certification is a private certification body it is done through a private certification body called B Lab. And essentially you pay them, you send in an application fee, you say, here's why we're a public benefit company. They determine whether you qualify. And if you do, they give you that sticker, which is nice. Like it is a good way to show the world that you're putting your money where your mouth is. You really do believe in these public benefit purposes. All right, let's move on. So what about other options? These are pretty straightforward. If I hang up a shingle and don't do anything, I'm a sole proprietor. If I hang up a shingle with Amy and we don't have anything in writing, we're a general partnership. These are not great options because the risk is there's a lot of liability risk involved. So let's say Amy and I are in a partnership and we have decided we are doing our cross-stitch business. Sorry, Amy, you're on the hook because you, my friend, are about to run up $100,000 credit card bill and then escape to Venezuela where there's no extradition policy. Guess who has to pay? Me, because I am jointly and severally liable for any obligations that arose from the partnership. Delphoni asked, what is the advantage of organizing as a public benefit company? So let's talk about that real quick. The benefit is that, it's really good press. Let's be honest. So if I have a business that I think would qualify, and I'm not qualified as a minority-owned, I wouldn't qualify as a minority-owned business owner. I wouldn't qualify as a woman-owned business owner or any other potential qualifications that would be available, but I still want to look like a business that is giving back. So a customer could look at my business and say, oh, I want to benefit. I want to put my money towards something that benefits all. This company is looking at its decisions, not only in terms of shareholder profits, but really what's best for the environment, what's best for its customers, what's best for everybody involved. Then I might choose to patronize that company instead of a different one. So it's kind of good press. I hope that answered the question. All right.
Yes, thank you.
Great. All right. So now joint ventures. These are creatures of contract. They're really kind of project based. So it's a limited scope partnership or kind of like a limited scope partnership, but without it's whatever the joint venture agreement says. Jeff asks, for a single owner business, what are the trade-offs between LLC and corporation? And LLC is typically, this is a really good question. I might ask for Amy's help, but let's see what I can do first. An LLC is very simple. It is a pass-through entity. It is, if you are starting it by yourself, you don't need an operating agreement. It's just you know what you're going to do. You don't have to agree with anybody to do it unless there's a specific reason why, like you have a bank loan and the bank says, where's your operating agreement? And by corporation, I'm going to presume you mean an S corporation. And the answer to that is there may be some advantages to having an LLC that is taxed as an S corporation. So S corporation is really, I believe it's more of a tax status than it is than anything else. So there can be like my company, for example, is a LLC taxed as an S corporation. And the reason for that is my accountant advised me long ago that it was a good idea to have, instead of having my company pay me distributions and having all of my income be taxed as a distribution, some would be seen as ordinary income, and some would be seen as distribution. Those are taxed at different rates. I would be paying appropriate taxes on the appropriate income taxes and payroll related taxes that way. And so that's kind of the answer. I hope that helped. Maybe not. We'll see. Amy, any other insights there? Okay.
Get myself off mute.
Okay.
Yeah, the difference is primarily between an S corp and a LLC is primarily related to the pass-through entity and what gets taxed and at what percentages. And you can do, various companies have changed over an S corp. It also depends upon the state, because in New York, many companies are formed as S corps because they have more benefits from a New York state tax law and also from a disclosure when they are actually incorporating. Here in Pennsylvania, there are many companies who are LLCs, and then as they get bigger and they want, with the distributions, et cetera, they want to have the tax benefits. And it really does, it's kind of if everything is the same, it ends up being one versus the other. But when you're an S corp, you can take advantage of paying yourself a salary and things like that. When interest rates were low during the pandemic, I tried to remortgage my house and they would not, because they could not see, it was all based upon a Schedule C from a tax perspective. Whereas when I became an S corp, that is a payroll which is being shown. So the mortgage company was very happy once they saw a W-2. Yes, it was my company, but they saw the W-2 and they said, oh, good, you're an employee. It was beneficial for me to switch to the S corp to be able to show that, yes, I have a W-2 and I get paid by myself, So it really, you have to do the math. Health insurance comes into play. You can take it for your employees and yourself. However, you then have to report it as income if you're an owner. So that's the thing. You have to go plus and minuses on it. You have to do the math to make sure it makes sense. But there are a lot of people, again, in Pennsylvania who have chosen that S corp, and it is more of a LLC, an S corp for tax purposes only, but it's still an LLC.
Yeah, like mine.
Yeah.
Right. Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you for
Jeff, does that answer your question? We'll find out.
Okay, we'll find out. All right, let's move on then. So now, when should a new business form? Well, I formed my business when I had my first client. Easy enough. Or if you have your first sale, or if you have a critical mass of sales. I've had clients come to me and say, well, I'm really starting to make money off of this. Maybe I should organize. Yeah, maybe it's time. Remember those restrictive covenants, like my new the old cross stitch business that I sold, and I said that I would not compete for 5 years. Well, here we are 5 years later. Maybe I'm ready to start. Or any other reason. I'm going to look at the chat in just a moment. But one bad reason to start is to try to avoid liabilities. from an existing business. I had a client a couple of years ago who called me and said, so my company is in the middle of a lawsuit and I am being dragged in, and I don't want this guy ever to get anything from me or from my business. So I'm just going to start up a new business that does the same thing. And I said, oh, that's a terrible idea. He said, why? I said, because it's the same business. If that plaintiff finds out that you started up a new business and you're funneling things that would otherwise go to this business, which could potentially pay him to another business, believe me, there's going to be a fraudulent transfer claim coming your way. There are Pennsylvania statutes that basically say you can't try to avoid your debts. It's much more complicated than that. The statutory language is much more like if you without adequate consideration, which means adequate something of value, adequate payment, you transfer opportunities to a different company or a different place in order to try to avoid liabilities, then that is a grounds for a lawsuit. All right, let's look at the chat. Can you do W-2s when you have an LLC taxed as an S Corp, or only when the entity is an actual S Corp? You can have them when they are taxed as an S Corp, I believe.
Yeah, and it also depends on whether you're talking about the owner or the employees. If you have employees, absolutely, you can have all employees getting W-2s without any problem. It's just if it's an LLC, yeah, okay. So Chase, if it's the owner, you have to be an S Corp to actually have a W-2.
Right. Otherwise,
again, a selection to have from a tax purpose to be an S Corp for tax purposes. And that's when you can do that.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah.
And so.
All right. Thanks, Avi. I should have mentioned at the beginning, I'm not really a tax person. I have an accountant. He tells me what to do. I do it. It's amazing. I've outsourced that part of my life. So there we go. All right, let's move on.
Can I ask a question on that prior?
Yes.
For liability,
Mm-hmm.
I've also heard that the difference between coming from a sole proprietor to an LLC, one of the main reasons you want to do that is for protection of liability. Can
Absolutely.
you speak to that a little bit?
Absolutely, yes. If you are a sole proprietor, then whatever liabilities inure to the business, inure to you, the limited liability, really any corporate form, the purpose is to protect the owners from personal liability for corporate obligations or corporate liabilities, corporate debt, whatever you might want to put in that category. There are extraordinary reasons why an individual owner might still be liable, but either those have to do with what the owner did on a personal level, like I promise you, whatever. The old Lionel Hutz, I promise you a big cash payoff. That's a personal promise. That might not be a reason to hide behind the limited liability concept of an LLC or the liability protection of a corporation. The other is if an individual owner has provided a personal guarantee, which is a different issue, because then I as the individual owner say, yes, I will stand behind my business debts. I will, if something happens to this business, you can come after me. But that's really the issue with the sole proprietorship, is if there are obligations that arise from the business, you want to make sure that the individual doesn't necessarily have to stand behind those. Ooh, lots in the chat. All right. Okay. Let's see. So the comments were, there is a time limit after you form the LLC to notify the IRS that you want to be taxed as an S Corp, correct? You can't go back after a few years. Yes, the answer is it is time sensitive. You have to do it at the beginning of the tax year. I believe, isn't March 15th of any given year the deadline by which you need to?
That I'm not sure of, but
okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
think it's more of January of the prior, like right now, if you want to do it for 2023, you can submit it, but it may not be accepted. And I believe you have to do it by 12/31 of the tax year ending. I mean, there are, I have heard of people doing it like in November, applying for it for January. I don't think you can do it after the year. I don't think the March 15th deadline.
Well, I think March 15th for the year to come. That was my understanding, is that,
But
so
you can't
if
go
I,
back? Can you
Yeah.
go back? Like if you filed LLC for 3-4 years, can you say next year I want to be an S corp?
For next year, you can do
Yeah.
it. You can switch to becoming an S corp. Like if you file now for 2024, yes.
Okay, so you
Okay,
can't.
if you file now for 2020, I'm sorry, for 2023, probably. Okay, you can get it done. As I said, I've heard of people doing it in November. Okay, but it's all up to the IRS. But so you can do it now for 2023. Okay, you can't do it now for 2022. And definitely not for 21 or 20.
okay, thank you.
And again, I am a CPA, but I do not do taxes. I'm an operational accountant, so please talk to your tax accountant.
Yes, for all of these, we're not your, Amy is very gracious, and thank you for letting me call on you. And I'm sorry, I should have told you beforehand, but yeah, it's one of those disclaimer things. Like if you have specific questions, find your advisor and talk to them about it. So
And that's
here's
where that liability insurance comes into play, guys.
yeah, we'll talk about that too. All right, so where should a business organize, or why do companies organize in Delaware? All right, I'm licensed in Delaware, and my view on Delaware is they've got a really nice, robust body of case law. They've got judges who know what they're doing in all kinds of different business issues. So if you are in Delaware and you get sued, it's a great place to be. Otherwise, if you're not going to operate in Delaware, if you're not going to have substantial sales in Delaware, if you're renting if the business is renting property and the property is not in Delaware, I really don't see the point. There are a lot of considerations about where a business is going to organize, like where are there going to be tax breaks or tax obligations? Surprisingly, both of those exist in Philadelphia right now. The same business could be eligible for a new, I forget what it's called. It's called, I think, a new business tax credit, where you promise to employ a certain number of people within the next 18 months, the first 18 months of the business, you might get a tax break. But then there are also net profits and business privilege and wage taxes and other taxes that are specific to Philadelphia. So maybe you don't want to be here. And yes, I am in Philadelphia. And yes, I pay a lot of taxes in Philadelphia. I'm glad to do it. I love the city. Anyway, where is there a business-friendly environment? Are you going to be stuck in a courtroom if there's a business dispute and the judge has no idea what a contract is? Because it's not their area of expertise, so they really don't know. Which sounds strange, but happens. Is there a certain cachet to being somewhere? Like, think about if you're in Manhattan, that's a nice address. Is it tonier than saying you're on White Horse Pike in Cherry Hill? I mean, maybe it is. Maybe you want to look important. I don't know. But really, when companies organize in the first instance, the question is going to be, where are you doing business? Where are you located? Where are you operating? That's really it's fairly straightforward. Can be anyway. So next. Oh, come on, computer. Now, how does a business organize? This is the nuts and bolts. So first you choose a unique name.
I'm going to actually stop you there.
Yeah.
Go back to where companies should be.
Okay.
Because one of the things, and again, I'm not a tax person, but taxes are one of the reasons we do everything. The US, we're going to pay taxes, federal taxes, state taxes, city taxes, etc. And you have to consider that. But when you're in, the more locations you have, and this is considered nexus when you get into the operations of an entity, is where you are in the States, and I'm not talking if you're going to be an international company, because when you start out the company, rarely are you going to be suddenly international. You might be, but if we're looking at the normal businesses, and especially with professional services, we're going to be doing our business here in the US. We might have international clients. That's a whole nother situation, but we won't have a plant located in a outside country. But if we're doing business here in the United States, where you do your business is important. So we mentioned before, if you own property, okay, or if you rent, those are important considerations to consider when you are having what's called nexus. And it is in what states are you operating? And in some situations like Philadelphia, what cities? And the same thing, where are your employees going to be based? Where is your home location? All of those things need to be considered when you look at when you're incorporating, because you might have employees, you might have had some people, you're going to be hiring people, you're going to be virtual. So you're going to have across the states with payroll expenses. All right. You might have a internet business, and you're going to be selling across the United States. So you might have sales across multiple states. Maybe most of them are in Florida. No, Florida's not great. In Texas, because it's related to cowboys. I don't know. Not the Eagles, obviously, but there's things to consider. So just make sure that all of that comes into play when you are thinking about where you're going to be incorporating, is what states are you going to be doing things in. So
yeah.
Thank you.
Now let's talk about what are the nuts and bolts. So the first is choosing a unique name. If you choose a non-unique name, there's a risk of confusion. There's a risk of a cease and desist letter from someone who had the name in the first place. And there's also the risk that the name may not be accepted where you are trying to organize the business. Under state law, every entity has to have a unique name, but what unique is depends on the state. I tried to register when I started up to do business in New Jersey as Bloom & Bloom LLC, because that's the name of my entity. And there was a Bloom & Bloom LLP already in existence. They're accountants. I hear they're lovely. There was no ampersand in their name. They were a different corporate form. I still could not use the name Bloom & Bloom because it was too close to the existing entity. So then the nuts and bolts, you file the paperwork, you get yourself an EIN, you register not only to pay taxes in the state, but also you file articles of organization, a certificate of organization, articles of incorporation, whatever the state calls the document that you file at the state level in order to start the business. And then different municipalities have different rules about whether you need to register to do business. Philadelphia definitely does. Other places do as well. Like I've run into the issue in Radnor, I think in Haverford. There are different municipalities are entitled to make their rules and say, yes, you need to pay taxes here, or you need to pay an annual fee to do business here. You might need certain certifications to start up. For example, I have a client right now that they're starting to build up a lead testing business. He needs lead testing certification, EPA certifications, individual certifications. You need to get your agreements in order, like your lease and of course, your operating agreement if you have one, shareholders agreement, your standard services agreement, and protections you need to protect. And I think at that point, we are going to be pausing. Right, Zoe?
Yes, we're going to do the breakout rooms.
Okay.
So do we have set amount of time you'd like to do?
Yep,
10
15 minutes. All right. And we have, everybody can put okay. We've got 24 people. So how about 6 groups of 4? All
Yep.
right. And I'm going to put the discussion. So what I'd like everyone to do, there are a number of new people, by the way, who potential members and also members who have not been with Beacon for a while. So please do your best to welcome them. Do a quick, like 2-minute introduction so everyone knows who you are and such and what you do, maybe even, what you're looking for, something like that. But the main point of this is to talk about what business mistake did you make? It's in the chat. What business mistake did you make, see, or experience that taught you a lesson you use now in your professional life?
So next, let's talk about protecting the business. That is where we stopped. By protection, the obvious thing that everybody thinks of is insurance. And I'm sure everybody's pretty familiar with these options for insurance. I'm just going to touch on a couple real quick. One is key person insurance and the other is cyber liability insurance. Key person insurance exists for that rainy day that we all know could come. God forbid your business partner gets hit by a bus. He had the institutional knowledge. Key person insurance is a policy held by the company to potentially replace him or pay his heirs so that his equity does not get so that his equity in the company does not become an asset of his estate and is you're therefore trying to run a business with someone's decedent estate. This is not a good idea. And decedent estate is not as agile in making decisions as a human being would be. And then cyber liability insurance is a big topic, and I'm sure everybody has heard of it, thought of it, maybe even attended some meetings or presentations about it. Back in I think I got my first cyber insurance policy in 2018, and the premium was very low. And provided that I maintained some pretty straightforward requirements in order to keep my insurance in good standing, it was fine. And these were things that, look, to have a cyber liability insurance policy, there are certain thresholds that a company has to make and meet. You have to have sort of basic safeguards in place. You have to have a policy that you come back to over and over again. You have to have a recovery policy. It's the stuff you should be doing anyway. But with the pandemic, because everybody went home at the same time, as you can imagine, breaches just skyrocketed. So my policy tripled in cost. I will still happily pay it because there are things that a cyber liability policy does that I probably couldn't do on my own. For example, if I am involved in a breach or my company is involved in a breach, and I have met the qualifications of my policy, then the policy steps in to inform the affected persons, to give me, they cover spin doctors. So it's not horrible local attorney loses her client's information, how terrible. There's a different spin to it. Local attorney is yet another victim of fraud or something. I don't know. I think the takeaways for cyber liability for a client of yours, or if you yourself are in this position, are you receiving information that somebody would not want to have shared? And if the answer is yes, consider a policy. I know I don't get any kickbacks from insurance companies. I promise. I just really like having one because it helps me sleep well at night. The next thing, so we talked a little bit about intellectual property issues in my breakout session. And I'll just touch on these because we have a true expert in this room. I would not want to step on his toes, Fred Wilf. But the basics are, if you have a brand, it's a trademark issue. If you have a fixed creative product, that is a copyright issue. If you have a new process or product, that's a patent issue. If you have a secret sauce that you don't want anyone to find out about, that's a trade secret issue. But the real question is, who owns it? And this is a complicated question, and it might be a different answer than you think. So when you, so let's say I work at a web design company and they hired me because I have a unique vision. I have a style that I use. There are some things about my style that are consistent in everything I do. That's why they hired me, because I have such a great eye, right? I understand that the web design company hired me and I am their employee, not to sit around and twiddle my fingers, but rather to create to create template web designs, right? That's what I'm there for. I incorporate that secret sauce into what I do. But is it everything that has those design components in it that is part of what I'm doing for the company? The answer is hopefully no, because if I want to hold on to that, I don't know what my future holds, right? I don't know if, in 2 years they're going to say, Bloom, it's been fun, but out you go. So maybe the products that I have designed for the company specifically, these templates, those are the property of my employer, which makes sense. It's what they hired me to do. But maybe the themes that weave all throughout my products, I hang on to, and I essentially have licensed those to my employer, and only to the extent that they are incorporated into those specific designs. The themes reside with me. Those are mine. Does that make sense? It's hard for me to see, I'm not in a live room, so I can't see anybody nod or shake their head or say, you're crazy, but I'm going to pretend that made sense.
Yes,
right.
It made sense.
Thank you. All right. And speaking of that, what are a couple things that you and your clients can expect to see on contracts? Now, this isn't really sort of a brief overview, of course. There are as many contract issues as there are contracts in the world, right? But the basics are, going back to my first week of law school: offer, acceptance, consideration. These are the elements of contract. There has to be an offer for something specific. I offer to sell you this Bic pen for 50 cents. Acceptance: yes, I will purchase that Bic pen for 50 cents. You pay me 50 cents, the pen is yours. The end. You would be surprised at how often these are not met. There is project creep. There is unclear language. And we were talking about this in the breakout session as well. My view of contracts is they're like boundaries. And we all like to set good boundaries with people so that nobody feels like they're being taken advantage of, nobody feels hurt, and everybody knows what the other person and their own obligations are. So if in doubt, write it down. Does it have to be formal? No. It can be a series of emails. As long as you can show where there is an offer, acceptance of that offer, and a payment or promise to pay, you're good to go. We talked a little bit about intellectual property provisions like work for hire, which is where my employer has hired me, the web designer, to create these template web designs. If I create them, it is a work for hire. Those belong now to my employer. The secret sauce that I have brought in, those design aspects, are licensed. So I can license those in the context of those web designs, right? Indemnification provisions are on most contracts. And I will tell you, I have been practicing law for quite a while now, and I still have to read these out loud so that I understand what they mean. What they should say, what I think they should all say is, if I do something wrong or cause something to be done wrong, you do not have to take care of it for me. I'm not saying I'm taking care of it, but you don't have to take care of it for me. I will stand in your stead and I will determine what I get to do with that, whether it is sue the pants off someone or settle or whatever it is. That is the key of an indemnification provision in a contract, or at least what I think it should say. And then restrictive covenants. These are non-competes, non-solicitation agreements, things where I agree not to do something that otherwise I would have a right to do. Now, let me say that right now, restrictive covenants are they're a hot button issue. because there has been some recent proposed legislation on whether they are enforceable and to what extent, and whether they should be enforceable. Remember, there was a time, this maybe 10 years ago, 15 years ago, Jimmy John's, the sandwich company, made all of its sandwich employees, all the guys who make sandwiches behind the counter, sign, what was it, non-competes, non-disclosure agreements. Those guys are making $5.25 an hour. Like they don't have anything important that you want to protect against. So I mean, that's of course an extreme example, but right now the concept of restrictive covenants, when you are not someone selling a business, like me selling my bespoke cross-stitch business, there's some scrutiny being paid to whether your typical employee is appropriately beholden to a restrictive covenant. We're gonna see a lot of litigation in the next few years on that if that legislation goes through. So here we are, almost at the end. Troubleshooting. Pardon?
One quick comment on the contracts and such.
Yes.
When I first started my business, of course, got liability insurance. And one of the questions was, do you have contracts for every single client? And at the time, it was relatively new, did not have contracts for everyone. And my liability insurance was quite high. And I said, wait a minute, what happened there? And they said, well, you don't have a contract. So I said, so if I have my client sign a contract, I said, oh yeah, your liability insurance is much lower because you have that legal document. I went, oh, okay. And that was my start of all my contracts being done. So
right.
We got to a lawyer and got the contract language and everything. And you'll probably mention it with the next section with, which is update those, make sure they're frequently looked at by your lawyer.
Mm-hmm.
Make sure things, like you said, with the non-compete and other things that might be in your contract, said if that law changes, a lot of those contracts are going to have to be modified, or at least the template will be modified moving forward. So,
right. So
we also have
question.
A question. Yeah. Do you see on the chat? There's a question.
Yes. So the question is, will lawsuits affect only employees or consultants 1099s as well? Oh, so it's going to affect everyone, I think. It's hard to say. And I presume that this is a question about whether restrictive covenant litigation is going to affect, like what the scope of that law is going to be. And the answer is it's going to be huge, because it will not just affect employees, it will affect consultants and 1099s as well. In fact, I personally do not understand from a legal perspective how you can have a restrictive covenant on a consultant, because the whole point of a consultant is they have to be able to go out and do something else. So how can you not employ them and just have them as an independent contractor and say you have to pay your own taxes for this? And by the way, what you're doing for me, you can't do for anyone else, even though I'm not hiring you full-time to do it. It's ridiculous. I think it's unconscionable personally, but what do I know? I'm just some guy sitting in South Philly, So, all right. Is a business in trouble? And if it is, how do I know? Well, we talked a little bit about lack of clarity in contracts. If you have project scope creep and you don't have things written down, then this is a problem. If it's not, if someone says, if I say, I will sell you this pen for 50 cents, and you say, yes, I will purchase your amazing cat who's sleeping right here next to you for $500. And I say, okay, what am I agreeing to? Am I agreeing to the sale of the pen? My priceless cat? I don't know. It's hard to say. Payment issues. Do you have enough money to cover your monthly nut? Are you running into these issues? And if so, are there consistent reasons that you're running into these issues? One of my very first clients had an issue. Nobody would ever pay him. He didn't know why. Why aren't they paying me? He says. He did stucco installation, and no one would pay him because he did such a terrible job. He never flashed out the windows, so there was instant water infiltration. Like, duh, this is a problem. That's trouble. He didn't realize it. not the brightest bulb. Anyway, that goes to third party dissatisfaction, but think a little bit in modern terms. What happens if you have terrible reviews? What happens if someone is paid to write a false terrible review? Like, what do? There are services that can take care of that, but this is how big a problem is it? I think with online content, any kind of online content, if it could, I mean, the number of questions I've had about, do I need to post something that's this offensive because of the person who wrote it? Or, this is someone's personal online presence and they've said these horrible things. What do I do? The number of questions I've gotten about it and how serious they are. It all depends on the situation, on how public things can be. Not everything is as public as you think it is. Can you figure out how to move that bad review to the second page? Because people don't click through to the next page of anything, So if you have will a good web presence save you from someone finding out about that, drunken arrest 15 years ago? Maybe. Another problem you might have is that you have not met state or local requirements. For example, you have failed to file your annual report in New Jersey or your decennial report in Pennsylvania, which then will be an annual report. And if you do not file it as an annual report because you're like, what do you mean? I thought it was a decennial report. You will not meet state requirements and you will be in bad standing in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Have you paid your taxes? Have you paid them on time? Have you paid them in full? That is, and have you paid your, if you have local assessments, for example, a business improvement district assessment, what happens if you don't pay them? Well, it all depends on what kind of charge you don't pay, but I have definitely had instances or heard of instances, thankfully not my clients, where someone will come to their shop and find it padlocked by the Department of L&I, and they're like, what the heck? This is not good. And then this is my favorite question that I get from clients. I got a thing in the mail, what is it? And it could be anything. And that's why I love that question. Most recently, so things could be as simple as I filed a new business. I have a new business now set up, and some company sent me something in the mail that says, you need your posters. You have to pay $50 for posters. And the answer to that is no, you don't. You can download them for free and stick them wherever you want. Stick them in if you have an office, stick them in your office. If you don't have an office, make them available to your employees, send them to them, if there's no actual physical workspace. But recently I had 2 thing in the mail questions, which actually were pretty impactful. And the one that was most impactful was a client of mine said, I got a thing in the mail. Is this real? I looked at it. It was a solicitation letter from a lawyer saying, you've been sued in municipal court. Here's the case number. Let me know if you want me to represent you. So I looked up the case in municipal court in Philadelphia. Sure enough, it existed. My client had not received service of process. They hadn't gotten anything yet. So I had to call and say, yeah, this is real. What do you want me to do with it? And so we were able to settle it. But it was a big thing in the mail question. It's not as though because my client hadn't been served, the clock hadn't run yet. It's municipal court, which means that there's already a hearing date. So if they hadn't done anything, they would have had a trial last week. And so that is all I have. Whoop. Do you have any questions, comments, concerns, rave reviews? Okay. Thank you so much. I really appreciate this. It was lovely to speak.
Yeah, and before everybody drops off, we want to get a picture of the group. So turn your cameras on. Zoe, take our picture of everybody. Those.
All right, I see it. So we're going to take the picture now. Smile. All right. I got it. So we're good. But did anyone have questions though? Because I know you covered so much that was really helpful.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I've definitely
Can
Perfect.
everybody mute themselves? Okay, good. Yeah, please. We've got a great job, Nella, from Rob, and a well done from Fred. Thank you very much. Rave reviews sent from Jerry. Bye. And so, yeah, anybody though, questions for Nella at all?
I did have one question, and this is something that came up in a previous job where there was an employee kind of working on personal projects with company property, like computer, during company time.
Uh-huh.
But technically, the work product was something that we didn't offer. But what should the employer do in that situation once they become aware of that? And does that employee's work then belong to the company because they were doing it on company time with company property? Or I'm just curious if you have any thoughts on that.
It's a good question. So I think if the employee was doing company work on company time with company property and there was explicit language in the handbook or their employment agreement saying things you create here are ours, then that would be, in theory, that work would belong to the company, even if it's something they didn't do. And invention assignment agreements can actually be really comprehensive. I have a client who was working on something totally outside of the realm of his employer for several years. The employer knew about it. He was very upfront with them. And he has now created a product that he wants to sell, which again, totally independent of his work with the company. But he can't find his employment agreement because he was employed in the mid-90s. So it doesn't, like, he's been there that long. Nobody knows where this thing is. So the question is this product his or the company's? And we have said it is his because we're pretty confident the company can't say this is ours. But I think it really depends. It should say in the employment agreement or handbook what happens in that situation. And if it doesn't, then I think you kind of have a hard road to hoe to say, oh yes, that definitely belongs to the company. I mean, she or he shouldn't have been doing it on company time and company property anyway. That wasn't the reason they were hired. But that's a different issue entirely.
Yeah. My ex was employed by Bell Labs many years ago. And that was one of those, whatever you think of, whenever you are awake, even if you write it down on a napkin while you're at a restaurant at a dinner, anything you do is ours.
Yeah.
And that was one. And Fred, I'm sure you've seen this a lot in your area.
There's been a ton of cases, and I've been involved in a bunch. So I'll second everything Nella said, which is the best thing that any business can do, and anybody working for a business, if there's any concern, get a contract signed between the employee and the business specifying exactly how this works, whether it's the Bell Labs approach that says that the company owns everything regardless, or whether it's something that says that we expect the employee to be doing some stuff on the side that the employee owns. And there's a lot of large companies that do all of the above, and I've written a couple of those myself. It also means you have to be careful. If you hire somebody, you're building a new business, you're hiring somebody who has a full-time gig, a full-time job, and you ask them to do something on the side, you have to be first understand what their deal is with their employer so that they're allowed to do stuff on the side. Otherwise, their employer might own it. And I've had a couple of cases like that. But I'm just reinforcing everything that's already been said. I can go into more detail for anybody who wants to talk offline. But go to Nella, get a document signed.
Beacon is the premier executive networking organization serving the Mid-Atlantic region. To learn more, go to beaconforlife.org.